welcome to Book Lust. I'm Nancy Pearl. My guest today at University Bookstore is Deborah Harkness, whose first novel, A Discovery of Witches, has just been published. Deb, thank you so much for coming by the store.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a wonderful place.
Your first novel has just been, this great success. And did you expect anything like the response that you got?
No, I don't think any author could possibly expect the book to be embraced so quickly and so positively. And we may have had a few little hints along the way. I think there was certainly a lot of enthusiasm from foreign editors when it was first at Frankfurt, but still it's no guarantee that ordinary readers are going to pick it up and want to read it. So it's been so exciting.
Well, tell us a little bit about the book, how you described the book to yourself.
Well, it was a wonderful accident. It was nothing I really decided. It sort of came at me from the form of a question. So it's a book that came about from the question of if there really are witches and vampires, like all of the popular fiction seems to suggest there are, what on earth do they do all day? What do they do for a living? And about 6 weeks later, I had a couple of hundred pages and came out of my office and said, I think I'm writing a novel. So when I tried to describe it to somebody, as somebody said, well, what is it about? And I said, I think it's going to be about a reluctant witch, a witch who comes from a long line of witches, but doesn't want anything to do with her power. And that's something that I see an awful lot of teaching in college. I see a lot of young people who have so many gifts and so many special abilities, but who are, for whatever reason, afraid to kind of unleash them, afraid of what might happen. So the idea of writing about a witch who might not want to be a witch was pretty irresistible. And then, of course, it's also about a lost book, Ashmole 782. So it's really also a love letter to books and libraries.
And you're a history professor.
I am.
In Southern California, at USC?
I am at
Yes.
USC.
And what area is your specialty?
I actually teach European history from 1400 to 1800, and my specialty is the history of science.
Wow.
So they always tell novelists to write what you know. So my reluctant witch, Diana Bishop, is also a historian of science. Works a little later than I do, but also is interested in the history of science and magic.
Had you plotted out, did you know how it would end when you began it?
Interestingly enough, I always thought of Diana and Matthew's story from very early on as being something that would be told in 3 movements. I read a lot of classical literature and plays, and there's a good reason why there's so many things that go in 3 acts. So I thought of their story as something
from Aristotle.
Right, exactly. So my extent of my outline were the first 3 lines of the book. It begins with absence and desire. It begins with blood and fear. It begins with a discovery of witches. That was my outline. And I wrote the first chapter of this book, and I wrote what I believe will be the last chapter of the 3rd. And now I feel like we're on a drive. You're all in the car with me.
Right.
We're somewhere outside the city limits of Seattle driving for the East Coast. And I know where we're headed, but I'm not exactly sure how we're going to get there.
Right, what route you're going to take.
Or if the car will break down or where we'll stop for lunch. But
right,
yes.
right. Yeah, don't forget lunch.
Yeah,
That's an important
absolutely.
part. That's an important part of it. Does Diana, besides having the same occupation as you do, broadly speaking, does she share any of your qualities?
I think Diana is more wish fulfillment for me. I would love to be as brave and as able to regroup, I think, as Diana is. Certain of her activities I share with her. I was once a very dedicated rower, and I am right now do my very best to be a dedicated yoga practitioner with mixed success, and I do love tea. So there were a couple of things, but I think more than anything else, I'm always struck when I look around me at how many of us are living our lives from one to-do list to the next and one appointment to the next. And I think that Diana has a certain amount of that in her own character, of filling her life with all kinds of stuff.
Right. So she doesn't have to think.
So she doesn't have to think, exactly.
Right.
And so part of the story is about her sort of gradually starting to actually think and, more importantly, feel. And not to be so bound up in what she should be doing next on her list.
Now, I know that there are a lot of romance writers who have PhDs in English and, are writing romances. How did you come to the point where you knew that that block of free time was going to be devoted to this?
I think for me it was about being able to have the first couple of quiet hours in a day before the email started, before the memos
Right.
hit my desk, before I needed to think about what I was going to lecture about that afternoon. So my real writing time tended to happen between about 6 and 8, 5:45 and 7:45, and with a big cup of tea. And it came to be something I looked forward to all day. So when I was stuck in traffic or when I was at the supermarket, I think part of my brain was always working on it. And I made it a point not to ever stop writing for the day without knowing what the first thing I was going to write tomorrow would be.
Oh.
I think sometimes we tend to, if we're really inspired, we tend to write ourselves right into a brick wall.
Right.
And then the next day, we don't really know what to do next. So I always
Right.
tried to stop before that point. And I think that really made it possible always to look forward to that moment of turning on the computer and having that time to myself. And otherwise, I also think that teaching was really a really helpful thing to be doing at the same time, because as a historian, what I do is tell stories.
Right.
So it was a really good reminder of the power of character, the power of a narrative arc,
Right.
whether it's the French Revolution or a story about
Right.
a reluctant witch and a 1,500-year-old geneticist. It's all about setting, character, tone, pace. I almost never ended with a chapter ending. I would always go to even if it was just the first sentence of the next chapter, so I wouldn't have that moment of break. And of course, life intervenes.
Right.
And sometimes you think you're going to pick it up the next day, but a disaster happens, or your
Right.
dog gets sick, and
Right.
your writing time gets taken away from you.
Yeah.
So it was a really nice way to always have some forward draft, is I guess the right term.
There's some authors who fall in love with their main characters. Dorothy Sayers, I think, fell in love with Lord Peter Wimsey, and some of those novels are also set in Oxford. But did you fall in love with that 400-year-old geneticist?
I didn't, and in part I wanted the two of them to be a little prickly.
And they were.
And they
you accomplished that, yeah.
I'm an academic, and we're not always the easiest people to get along with. So I didn't really want to romanticize either what vampires and witches were, or romanticize what it was to be a scholar. And it's a tough career, and you need to be pretty confident. And interestingly, not everybody really warms to Diana or Matthew. So at the time, people said, well, that's a little risky to write protagonists that people may not like. And I said, some of my best friends are people I didn't like at first.
Yeah.
So I think people come around to them, but I do think there's a little bit of a sense of not quite sure. And I think even by the end of it, you're not quite sure if you can trust all the players in the story as much as maybe you want to.
Do you like books with non-trustworthy main characters?
I don't know as if I've ever thought about it that way. I definitely like my characters to surprise me. I don't like it when I figure out a character quite early on and then nothing really surprises me that they do. And so along with when I was writing it, especially Matthew, I never knew what he was going to do from day to day. And sometimes he'd get into a situation and I think, oh, that's what he would do. And I wouldn't really like it. But I knew that's what he would do in that situation. And my 14-year-old niece is desperate to have a boyfriend who's a vampire. And I just think it's problematic in all kinds of ways.
Right.
And so I didn't want to deny that part of it. At the same time, I wasn't really interested in writing a horror book. And so I needed to find a way to walk that line, and I hope I have. I think people who want their vampires horrifying are not going to like Matthew, but...
Yeah, I guess I one time tweeted about, or wrote a review, I guess, of a book with one of my favorite vampire books is called Sunshine by Robin McKinley. And actually, I think her main vampire character, is a little bit like Matthew. And I wrote about him and said that he was, devastatingly handsome. That's how I saw him. And the author on her blog said she was very grateful that Nancy Pearl really loves sunshine and talks about it at every opportunity, but the main character, who's Conrad, I guess his name is not handsome. He's a monster, she said. And I thought, well, isn't it up to the reader to say that he was handsome or not?
With Matthew, I was also playing with the idea that somehow vampires represented a kind of almost a genetically superior creature with superior senses and superior physical attributes, that somehow in the process of becoming a vampire, this had brought them to a level of perfection. People say to me, are there no unattractive vampires? And I say, well, actually, Mart in this story is not known for her great beauty. She's known for other things. So, there are creatures who, not even vampire blood will straighten out their arthritis. But for a younger man like Matthew, it just means, he's really quite dishy. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
One of the things that is so great about your book, I think, is that it is, as you said, a kind of hymn of love for libraries and books and reading and knowing and history and all of those things. And I think that where did that come from?
My godparents from a very early age enrolled me in a children's book club.
And where did you grow up?
I grew up outside of Philadelphia, and I got 2 books a month, and it was heaven. And my town did not have a library. We had a bookmobile.
Oh, yeah.
And that was my favorite day of the week. I remember going up the stairs, the whole bit. My school libraries, I could tell you where The Witch of Blackbird Pond and Edward Eger's Half Magic were shelved, where the Helen Keller biography was. So books were just a crucial part of me growing up. And when I started this book in 2008, libraries were not under the same level of attack that they are now. There was no sense of shutting down 400 libraries in the UK. So it really, for me, I cannot imagine a life without libraries or books. And I think that we can be awfully cavalier and casual and think we don't need them. But of course, as a historian, I've heard all this before. This is what people said in 1450 when the printing press was invented. And they said, oh, well, this is the end and everything will change and no one will write anymore and it'll all be print. Now it's what they're saying about things on computer screens. A book is a really ancient technology. It's not going anywhere.
And your novel just has that, part of it is the beginning, is set in the library. I never know how to pronounce
the Bodleian.
Bodleian. I always want to say Bodleian. The Bodleian Library at Oxford. And, you get a sense of the kind of reverence of that place as a keeper of a people's history. Because she's a historian of science, you just very cleverly put in all of these great historical figures that very few people perhaps have heard of.
Right. And there's a wonderful moment where, some of the people she has heard of, Matthew has to tell her gently, were really not as exciting as she's and other historians think they were. It really is a sense when you walk into an old library like the Bodleian, you really are struck by who has walked over those floors, who has sat at your desk. Those desks have been there since around 1600. So think of the people who've sat at them. And you do get that sense of being part of a very great tradition of words and books and learning. And, that's a real privilege. And also, libraries are just, I think, really magical places. You don't know, nobody really knows what's in a library. And every time they they find new bits and pieces of, modern authors and lost books from the Vatican. It's a really, they are special places.
When you were writing this, did you go to Oxford and did you get to do all that great overseas research?
Well, I think I've been doing the research for this book without knowing it since about 1984, but I did do my dissertation research at the Bodleian.
Oh, you did?
So I spent about 11 hours a day there for about 18 months and have gone back every occasion I can. So there's a lot of fond remembrances. Actually, when someone wrote to me from Oxford to tell me that, alas, the traffic regulations had changed since I had been there. So I have Matthew taking a route to a cafe that is now prohibited by city officials. I said, oh, well, sorry. It's, it's the way you used to get there in my day. But it is a wonderful thing to be able to kind of go back to a place in your mind that you've loved.
Are you a romance reader?
I mostly read nonfiction as a historian. I do have some weaknesses, though. I have a very big weakness for Diana Gabaldon. So that is a historical romance that I have to admit, when the new ones come out, I'm the first person in line at the store.
Right. Yeah. One of the pleasures of A Discovery of Witches is that it combines different, I don't like the term genres. I think it ghettoizes books, but it combines different kinds of books.
Yeah.
So somebody who's looking for, who reads for like a meaty kind of book, can find it in there. But yet, when they meet.
Yeah. As soon as you hear that chuckle.
As soon as you hear that, you know that they're going to, in some way, get together against, her desires or her kind of feelings and whatever Matthew is feeling at the time.
I think that there's an awful lot of books about how hard it is to fall in love. And it strikes me that actually falling in love is pretty easy, but staying in love is hard. So I wanted Matthew, yes, we know from the minute there's the left, they're going to be together.
They're destined.
So let's just get on with it and get to the really interesting part, which is how are these two very intelligent, very independent, strong-minded people actually going to live together? So it's a little bit of an unorthodox romance from that point of view.
No, I love that because you're absolutely right. I mean, that falling in love is easy, but staying in love or, in a relationship is far harder.
Right, and even though we may not be witches in love with vampires, we have our own obstacles and baggage to deal with.
That's right.
So to really, I think, it's really going to be exciting to see how these two characters grapple with that. At the end of this book, they've known each other for 40 days.
Yeah.
And they've really thrown in their lot with each other, and I think so many of us can identify with that when we've fallen in love and we've started down that path and everything looks wonderful and rosy, and they are two strong-minded characters. There's going to be a few bumps in the road, I think, when they clash.
Did you envision this as a trilogy when you?
Yeah, I really did. And so for me, because in fact I wanted to have these kind of three component parts, I really did want sort of the first part to be about, the joy of first love and that sense of incredible possibility. But I do want to move on to some of the other things that happen in relationships as well, like meeting the family, which happens a little bit in this, and going outside that little bubble of two people to family and then to a larger world. Because I think that's what's really the challenge of a great relationship is how to exist beyond that. And also just the story of the manuscript, I think, needs to be told in a little bit greater depth. So, and I love series and I love chunky books. So for everyone out there who's cursing me because they've reached the end and it's not resolved, it was never going to be resolved. It was always something that, again, needed to have a little bit more time to tell the story.
Why do you think that that's so prevalent in fantasy these days, the trilogy? Because Justin Cronin's book,
I guess The Passage
is the first of a trilogy, and your sort of description of why you wanted to do that because of the kind of a classic 3 acts.
Right.
I wonder how many other authors are thinking that way.
I read so much material that's published before or written before 1600.
Yeah.
It's almost all in either 3 acts or 5 acts. And it really, there are good reasons for that, I think. And so many of, like, even Star Wars, with the 3 bits. So I do think there's good reasons for it. I think I'm very glad that I know where it ends, I think that sometimes with series you can kind of get to a place in the middle where you're just not sure
Right.
how this is ever going to wrap up.
Right.
And so that's the downside of a series,
Uh-huh.
I think, is when it gets to start dictating the terms to the author.
Right.
I hope that won't, I don't think that will happen here. I think the other reason, though, is just that when people fall in love with characters, they want to revisit them.
Mm-hmm.
And the temptation, I think, for an author to keep just adding that little bit more must be considerable. So again, I'm glad I have the discipline of that stop sign at the
Yes,
end of,
you know
of
where
the
it's
third
gonna,
book.
and yeah, and then the play will be complete.
Yeah, they'll come out
Come
and
out,
say,
yeah, right. Bow to the
It is-
audience.
bow to
and
the
say,
audience and
yeah,
this-
it's a
this
great,
is- this
it's
is
a
the
great
story's
sort
over.
of, yeah, great
Yeah.
sort of metaphor to do that kind of thing. So, are you hard at work on the second one?
I am hard at work on the second one and having a wonderful time. It's hard not to talk about it because that's really where my head is at their continuing adventures, but not wanting to spoil it for other people. So, and it's a wonderful challenge. You know, it's not, writing a second book is nothing like writing a first book,
Right.
it turns out. Every book is different and unique. I don't have children, but that's what parents say, yep, just like
Yeah.
having children.
Because you're traveling so much now for this book
Yeah.
to do that book, that must put a little bit of a delay. I mean, unless are you still able to write when you're?
I am able to write on airplanes, which is a wonderful thing. So for like being 5:45 in the morning, the phone on a plane, the
Right,
phone doesn't
right,
ring.
right.
I refuse to get on Wi-Fi
Yeah,
on airplanes.
right.
It's a very special time when there's not information coming at you from the outside. And for a writer, at least for me, that's what I most need. I need to be able to get lost in the
Right.
story and not have ringing phones, internet distracting
Yes.
me. So airplanes and trains are wonderful. Unfortunately, I don't get to write first thing in the morning usually this way. But
Yeah, right.
you know, you just have to be a little bit flexible about
yes.
that.
I think the best writers are flexible because maybe in the end or in the process of writing, they don't know what's going to happen.
Right.
And you have to be able to deal with that uncertainty or that direction that your character is taking you in, which you didn't quite expect,
Yeah.
as you said about Matthew.
Absolutely, and I think just as I can sometimes tell in a series where the temptation to just keep it going has gotten in the way of maybe what was a tight storyline, I can also tell in a series when it's been too overplotted and they know everything that character is going to do, and by God, that character is going to do it.
Right.
And again, I had a 3-sentence outline for the book, and I don't want to get in a place where the characters can't surprise me,
Right.
and surprise the reader.
And part of the trouble with those overplotted books is then for the reader is that you know you can see what's coming because the author knows, and like it or not, they're going to telegraph that in some way.
Right.
I think that just goes kind of with the territory.
Well, the other day when I was writing, in walked 2 characters I had never imagined, never anticipated. They walked right into the center of stage and started to talk, and I said, where did you 2 come from? And so it was a wonderful reminder again about some of the best things that happen in life are unplanned and they're accidents.
That's right. I know that the writing of your dissertation was different, because you're writing a scholarly document and all of that, different from this. But did it have your dissertation an overlap with this book? Did you write about Giordano Bruno, for example?
I tried to write about Giordano Bruno, and it didn't quite work. My dissertation was on John Dee, Queen Elizabeth I's court astrologer.
Oh, yeah.
And there's a funny overlap with the book. I mean, he was an alchemist, so my knowledge of alchemy goes back to that. But in 1994, I actually found a lost magical manuscript that belonged to him at the Bodleian.
You're kidding.
No, it had been missing since the early 17th century, and it was kind of hiding there in plain sight under an alternative name in the catalog. And I looked and I thought, that can't be it. And we, a lot of us have been looking for it for a really long time, and as soon as I stopped looking for it,
there it was.
Called it up. Sure enough, it was what it was. Called the keeper, wrote a note to the keeper, went home for the night. When I went in the next morning, they said, the keeper wishes to see you. And I had indeed found this lost magical manuscript, and it was, that through alchemical transformation went straight into A Discovery of Witches. So it is that nice tie back into that original scholarly experience.
Fabulous story.
Isn't that great?
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow. So your interest in the subject of magic and all of the supernatural things. I mean, Jonathan Dee was a pretty. That was his name.
John Dee.
John Dee.
I'm thinking Jonathan
I'm thinking,
Norrell.
right. Was a. I mean, he was a pretty remarkable character, and either far ahead or far, back of his time. I just love that idea that that's what you wrote about, and then you, in a way, transformed it into fiction.
Well, it's interesting. When the period that I study, people believed that the natural and the supernatural were absolutely inextricably twined together.
Right.
And we think of ourselves as so modern and rational, and yet if you walk through a bookstore, you see an awful lot of books that are about witches and vampires and ghosts and angels and spirits. And these characters exert the same pull on us as they did on the 16th century. Now, what's fascinating to me is that would be the case.
Right.
That we could have quantum mechanics
and
angels.
Right. Coexisting.
Exactly. And so what I really wanted to do in this book was to almost try to imagine the world that we live in through 16th century eyes, through that belief that they really are your next door neighbors. And how would that work? How would that translate into the 21st century? Because our lore about witches and ghosts comes from the 16th century. So it's really almost an attempt to update the worldview that I study in the past, put it into the present in a way that would satisfy the logical needs of an adult.
Why do you think these books are so popular now?
I think it's because we really want to believe that there's something more out there than is immediately accessible and explainable through science. I think magic has come to mean limitless possibility, and that in a world that often seems narrowly bounded, that seems predetermined, where there seems to be a lot of things out of our control, the idea of magic as just this kind of world opener is so appealing. It's such a wonderful form of escape. In my period, that was seen as quite scary, but I think actually in our time, it seems quite hopeful.
Yeah, it is so interesting to compare the rationalist view, which we think that we have now, with the popularity of books like A Discovery of Witches and The Passage and Patrick Rothfuss's, sort of big trilogy. That's the second book is just out. I mean, I think that would be a wonderful topic for somebody to explore, because there was a period, I mean, in the 50s we had fantasy, children's fantasy. You mentioned Edward Eger, one of my favorites as well, but we didn't have this proliferation of books, novels about that for adults.
I think Harry Potter was a real turning point. So all my students now who are 21, they grew up on Harry Potter. And they love that sense of escape, and their parents all read to them Harry Potter and are looking for. So we have a whole new group of adult readers who were really shaped in a way by that wonderful world that J.K. Rowling created for all of us. And none of us are in her league. I think she's going to be the one they are writing about, like we write about Shakespeare in another couple hundred years. So it goes in cycles. And we just are at another moment where that wheel's turning.
And sociologically, it would be an interesting, what's happening and, what happened in this first decade of the 21st century. Well, that will have to be another question, another time. Deborah, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. This was a pleasure.
Good.
Real pleasure. Thank you.
You're welcome.